אני שמחה מאוד להזמין לבמה את אורחנו המכובד שהגיע ישר מברלין על מנת להרצות בפנינו על מהי משילות ומה בינה לבין ארגוני המגזר האזרחי כיום. כמה מילים על פרופסור אנהייר. פרופסור אנהייר הוא פרופסור לסוציולוגיה ודיקן בבית ספר הרטי למשילות בברלין. הוא המנהל האקדמי של המרכז להשקעה חברתית באוניברסיטת היידלברג. פרופסור אנהייר הקים וניהל את המרכז לחברה אזרחית ב-LSE וכן את המרכז לחברה אזרחית באוניברסיטת UCLA. פרופסור אנהייר הוא מהחוקרים הנודעים והמובילים ביותר בעולם בתחום המחקר והכתיבה האקדמיים בנושא המגזר האזרחי וארגוני המגזר האזרחי. כתביו מהווים אבני דרך אינטלקטואליות בתחום, בין היתר הוא העורך של השנתון העולמי לחברה האזרחית. פרופסור אנהייר, please.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your kind words of introduction, and thank you to the Van Leer Foundation and the Joint Committee, and of course to Benny and to Nissan for inviting me and hosting me so generously. I must say that Benny has an uncanny ability to suggest that I work on topics I probably would have worked on, but not at that time, but at some point in the future. And I had been thinking about the connection between governance and civil society for some time, and this invitation was impetus to do that. So what you will see in the next half hour is an initial attempt to come to terms with what does civil society have to do with governance. Right. So thank you, Benny, for suggesting that I think about it. This is the structure of my presentation, and I will walk you through an argument, and I will make the key argument about halfway through the presentation, and then return to it towards the conclusion and hint at what the implications might be. And what you find is that it does indeed resonate with what we heard this morning and what we just heard from the Ministry of Education as well. So let me start by not giving you a boring lecture about what governance is, but to give you a sense of what's involved here. Governance is one of those terms that comes up and you wonder, why haven't we had that term 20 years ago or 30 years ago? It's a very recent development in the social sciences. In fact, it has a much longer history, like civil society has a very long history, and we didn't really focus on it very much, and only in the last 10, 15, 20 years did civil society emerge as a main topic in the social science. Similar with governance. It goes back some time, and then it was discovered in the business world. The question was corporate governance, right? And it had to do with the allocation of responsibilities and rights and obligations in the modern corporation. And then political scientists picked it up, and they said, well, there is a difference between government and governance, as there is a distinction between management and corporate leadership. Right? So the two are together, right? Regulation, governance, corporate governance, management, and there is now a very, very elaborate literature on what governance is. And you see on this slide here two attempts that, and I could list many, many others to try to define what do we mean by governance. Right? And I prefer, as Benny knows, I prefer more simpler expressions, and I would like you to think about governance really about how well we manage public problems. Now, these public problems come in many, many different disguises, many different forms, right? Public health. How well do we manage public health? Education, right? So if the purpose of education is to educate the next generation and to make sure that they do a decent job at maintaining certain patterns in society and contribute to progress, how well are we doing at educating our people? Right? Environment. And I need not to give you a long list of what is meant by public problems. Right? How well do we manage public problems? Now, And here's one way to think about it. There's a framework, and it's that framework that I have worked with in the last few years. If you want to assess how well are we doing in managing these public problems, you don't want to do that in a very abstract. You have to identify those who are charged with dealing with that problem. They're legitimately charged in dealing with a particular public problem, be it climate change, be it financial markets, or the regulation of markets, be it retirement policies. Right? So there's this question of legitimacy, and you want to know, are those charged with dealing with that problem, do they know what they're doing? Do they have a plan? Right? Do they have a proposal? And is that proposal efficacious? So it's the question of efficacy. And if they have a plan, how well are they doing in implementing it? And that would be one of effectiveness in implementing a policy, implementing a plan, following through. And out of this interplay between efficacy and effectiveness, we could look at actual performance. Right? Now, I give you one example where this really matters, and I take the example from the Euro crisis, just where we don't know whether it's over yet, but there's a bit of a pause. A big problem in the Euro crisis was that some countries got too indebted. They accumulated public debt. Right? Greece was the culprit here, that everybody pointed at Greece. And they said, well, we know what we need to do. We have to make sure that Greece increases, right? Greece increases its tax revenue. So the problem with Greece is that it's not taxing effectively. And there are large parts of the country and large segments of the population that don't pay any tax at all. So the plan makes a lot of sense. We need to have a more equitable and a more effective way of raising tax revenue. But there was no way of implementing that. So they had a plan, but they were very bad at implementing the plan. There was no functioning tax authority. There was no bureaucracy that to work with you. So the performance of Greece in terms of tax revenue continued to be lagging behind of what you had in other countries in the Europe. Right? So, and if you have a continued, if you think about a cycle of going through effectiveness, efficacy, and performance, that cycle feeds back on your legitimacy. So you can have negative cycles, right? You can get in a downward spiral where those charged with dealing with a public problem lose the support of the population. And that is a very, very dangerous position to be in. So this is how I think about governance, right? We have those charged with dealing with the problem. We want them to be efficacious and effective, leading to a performance. Now, why do we live in a world then where so few of the more global, the transnational problems are in fact being settled? Now, think about climate change, think about migration, think about transnational crime. Right? Now, economists have looked at that and they said, well, we live in fact in a world, and that's no news to you, that is highly interdependent. So the actors that we want to solve the problems are not fully in charge of their own destiny. They can, in fact, not put forward plans and put forward measures to address many of the problems that we face today. Right? So the European Union continues to be incapable of dealing with migration, right? Because there is no actor with the capacity and legitimate to do so, to effectively deal with the problem. We tend to have issues with global warming, the environment, and think about the financial crisis as a case in point. This is very much at a transnational level, and I'm going to depart from that in a moment, but I want you to keep in mind that much of the thinking about the relationship between governance and the role of civil society also happens at the transnational, at the international level. And there we observe a serious mismatch between responsibility and capacity. Right? We expect international organizations and international treaties to achieve so much, but we are not putting resources behind it, and we're not creating the capacity so that these actors, be it the United Nations or being some other agency charged with it, can effectively manage affairs. Right? Both Benny and I, we spent time at UCLA, and the budget of UCLA, that's one large American university, right, is about the same, the budget is about the same as that of the United Nations. And that gives you an idea of how much of a mismatch we have. Now we're expecting UCLA to do a lot, right? But we're expecting the UN to do much more, right? Or the European Union. If you add all the highly paid bureaucrats in the European Union together in Brussels, as we refer to it, right? That's not much more than what you have in a larger European city in terms of administrators sitting there. So there is this capacity, and I'm going to leave that behind for the time being, but I wanted to deal with this early on. Now, if you look at the question, who is responsible? There are three main classes or types of problem solving or collective regulation. Or you might say three governance modes that have been proposed. And the first one is familiar to all of us. That's really the hierarchical governance by states. So you do have a sovereign, and the sovereign, including the use of the monopoly on the use of force, can, through centralized power, manage things. Right? So it requires high level of legitimacy. To do that, you have one centralized, one big actor looking after healthcare, looking after education, your security. And for government, it requires an awful lot of good information, because the government has, in a way, has to know what it is doing, and it needs good feedback mechanisms to bring this about. For that, you need a functioning public administration. So when we often say, oh, we deal with public problems through government, that's easily said, but it requires a lot of parameters to be in place. High legitimacy, good information management, and an effective administration. Now, this is the type 2, where we have collaboration between government, usually through some network with other private and public actors. So you have more of a devolved government, you have multiple actors coming in, and what this requires is a division of labor. It requires an accepted framework of how things are being done. Right? That can be a macro agreement, a macro policy framework, let's say between governmental ministries and non-profits implementing service. It could be a co-production of them. It could be that you have independent regulatory bodies that are not appointed by government. Right? It can be many things, but the difference here is that we need some form of a policy platform. And in a way, this kind of a new policy platform between government and the civic sector and the civil society is also what's being discussed here. I'll give you one more example, the way social services and welfare activities are distributed in most countries involves some sort of a framework contract between government and non-profit organizations. And then we have the third form, and that of problem solving, and that's largely based on self-regulation and a coordination, sometimes not formally spelled out in form of a policy, but sometimes evolving between primarily non-state actors, and that can be civil society, but can also be the business world. And the example of internet governance below shows you that the dividing line between where is the world of commerce and where is the world of non-profit organizations is a very, very fluid one. Right? That requires a multitude of actors. It requires devolved legitimacy and trust, right? And some form of coordination combined with competition. In the second type of governance I outlined to you, right, where you have a policy framework organized between government and the civil society, very often that framework does not emphasize competition at all. It doesn't invite competition. In fact, it is sometimes quasi-corporatist, that it spells out certain spheres. Oh, this is what you do, this is what we do, but we're not getting into each other's way. What you have in this third case is a system where you deliberately want to have actors competing for space and competing for voice. Right? So very, very different ways in which we can go about solving public problems. And let me move on to governance innovation, because I said I present the main argument against this background just about halfway through my presentation. I've been fascinated by governance innovations for a long time. Here you see the definition of what these means. Examples are also given here. And I deliberately choose a big example that most of us are familiar with. And it doesn't mean that we like those innovations, right? It just means that they are innovations put forward at some point, and they really made a difference. Like the introduction of the National Health Service in the UK, right? In the 1950s. Then how the Netherlands got hold of the terrible water pollution problem that they had in the 60s and 70s. Right? There simply were new ways of looking at an existing problem and enlisting different kinds of actors. Or the introduction of the public university in the United States about 100 years ago. A very controversial innovation being discussed at the moment in the context of Euroland in particular is the introduction of what is called a debt brake, so that you prohibit public bodies, whether it's the federal, the central, or the local government, from going into debt. A very radical step forward, right? That is a governance innovation, whether you like it or not. So innovations are not necessarily good for everybody, right? So if you look at governance innovations today, and in the project we're running at the Hertie School, we, on an ongoing basis, monitor different governments and different sectors of society worldwide, to the extent that we get the data, for new ideas. Is there anything new coming up, let's say, in France or in New Zealand or in the United States that would be of interest to other countries as well? Well, what you find is that at the moment, curiously enough, there are no big ideas that are at the level of general policy frameworks comparable to what we had to social democracy in the 1970s, or that we had comparable to what were in the United States were then called the neocons, right? So these big policy frameworks that say, oh, we're going to do things different in future, they know there. I think we live in a somewhat a non-ideological era at the moment, and innovations that you find tend not to be political in that regard, political in the sense of party political or ideologically based. They very often are not fundamental reforms, but they are tweaking the system and improving it, often at a local level, in a smaller context. And there we find that civil society initiatives are frequently involved. And then if you look more systematically, you also find that new ideas for these governance innovations do not come from government. They come from outside government. They are being brought to government, and not by political parties so much, but by organizations that may be related to political parties, but more than that, it's organizations of the wider civil society. And we thought about what are these innovations that are being pushed by civil society. Right? And we looked at a whole range of them. And we found some current some very common characteristics that you see listed here. Right? They tend to be quite uncertain in their outcome, and there is some risk taking that goes on behalf of these organisms. I'll give you examples in a moment. They require a lot of knowledge. At the beginning, local knowledge that people that are close to the problem have, that outsiders who may sit in some capital may not have. They're not embedded, right? They're not part of the problem, but they're also not part of the system. So they very often reach across established boundaries. They come with a long-term commitment, and there's a certain missionary effect to them, a bit of a show and tell, as we would say in the United States. So risk-taking, controversy, uncertainty, right? Local, not necessarily well-connected, sometimes reinventing the wheel. That's quite typical for the civil society-based innovations that we found. Here are some examples of it. If you're interested in more of these examples, we have a website. It's called Governance Report, one word, governancereport.org. Right? So www.governancereport.org, and there you see a list of innovations that we looked at. And I just want to, I don't have the time to go into any details with these, but I want you to just look at what we see as the challenge and what was the basic proposition and the key insight. Right? So many of you probably work in the not-for-profit sector or know of it. There is typically a big tension in non-profits between the revenue side and the mission. Right? And sometimes it's very easy to slip into a quasi-profit making mode, and you lose sight of your mission, and sometimes if you emphasize the mission too much, you get into resourcing troubles. Right? And we've known that for years. Right? And in the UK and in the US, people working in non-profits have pushed very hard to tell the legislator, say, hey, to some extent the problem we have is the problem of legislation. We need a new we need a new taxation law, we need a different corporate law for the kind of non-profit organization that we want to run. And the dividing line between profit and for-profit is far too rigid for the world out there. So they introduced what is called the L3C business entity, so a kind of a low-profit corporation. Right? The social impact bonds were all that are now very much discussed in the United Kingdom. I know they've been discussed in Europe and in the United States. Were also pushed from different civil society actors, this time from think tanks operating in London, being frustrated at a low performance of the criminal justice system in the United Kingdom. And keeping in mind that framework I showed you before, if you have continued low-performing systems, not only are they expensive, but they also take away from your legitimacy. Right? And the local councils in Britain were really concerned about that they're losing the support of the population because they were simply not solving the problem of released prisoners reoffending in a relatively short period of time and then finding themselves back in prison again. So the recidivism rate was very high, and that became a problem. And the solution is actually strikingly simple. What you needed to do, and as you see here, you needed a new allocation of risk involved in treating and releasing offenders. Right? So that there are incentives attached to success and rewards, and that there are negative sanctions attached to both government and others if there is failure. Right? But you see, it took somebody from outside government to suggest this. Right? And it fits very well with innovation research. Right? Where do innovations come from? They really come from the center of things. They don't come from the center of power. They come from the margins. Right? They come from people not being in the center. And for good reasons, because they have an incentive to innovate, and they also at the cross currents of many other pieces of information. And here are two examples having to do with new information technologies that also involve civil society as well. And for those of you who populate the internet, you know that there are thousands and thousands of initiatives, very often local, where local citizens share information and share ideas, and that by example is meant by the My Society website here as well. So civil society and governance innovations. Before I now come to the main argument, let's keep in mind what is so special about non-profits. I call them non-profits for, even though I know that we're doing away with this term, but let's just call it non-profits. And what's special, and I keep saying that to my students, there are really three things that you need to keep in mind. What's special about non-profits is not that they make no profit. It's much deeper than that, right? There's usually a value involved. They have a value base. It could be religious, that could be political, could be humanitarian, right? It's usually a much more complicated goal structure or an objective function, as economists would say, that you have in a non-profit compared to a business organization. And managing non-profit means also managing multiple stakeholders, because you don't have a shareholder, you don't have a dominant group in your organization that says, what we decide, this is the way it's going to happen. There is no one bottom line, there are very multiple bottom lines. And these bottom lines are typically tied to the values that you represent and that you want to further. And you have multiple revenue sources. Right? Multiple revenue sources. You have donations, you have fee income, you get money from government, from foundations, and so on. Right? And there's no other organizational form that has this peculiar set of characteristics. Value-based, multiple stakeholders, and multiple revenue sources. And you do that not sure about how well you're actually doing. Right? So you always have performance uncertainty as a manager of a non-profit organization. So multiple revenue streams, performance uncertainty. Very often we looked at that as a problem, right? When in fact it could be the reason why non-profits are really good, or why civil society organizations are really good at innovation. Because the argument that I would like to advance, and that Benny kindly suggested I should think about, is written there, that civil society organizations, specifically through stimulating civic involvement, are best placed to produce social innovations, and they're outperforming businesses and state in that regard. Now that's a hypothesis. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but it's something that we would have to explore. Why? Because first look at a non-distribution constraint. So the fact that you are not bound to make a profit. Right? You're only asked not to generate too much of a deficit. But you see, that allows you to move away from short-termism. That allows you to have a longer perspective for your organization. Right? It's not only that a non-distribution constraint prevents you from profiteering. No, it actually invites you to take the long view. Right? The value base you have expresses your commitments. Let's say your commitment to the local community. Right? Of course, values constrain. They also make you a bit blind. They can make you blind to how the world really works. But they can also engender, I think, commitment, and they motivate your staff, they motivate you to search for solutions, right? And the multiple stakeholder involvement means that you have to listen to different signals from different parties. So it makes you alert. And since your multiple stakeholders tend to cross borders, They tend not only be in your community, but they might be elsewhere. There may be government representatives, there may be business, maybe the business community, maybe the local civic leadership, there may be religious representatives, right? That means you get information from different parts of society. So you have a diversity of views. And having diversity of views and getting different signals is related to innovative behavior. That we know from the literature. And the same with your multiple revenue streams. That means you are in contact and you are accountable to, you're being asked to perform by different stakeholders. So the multiple perspectives that we see embodied in non-profits are in fact a reason why they may be quite innovative as organizations. And the same happens when with civic engagement, because the volunteers come from different walks of life and they bring with them different perspectives, and they may have sometimes crazy ideas, but sometimes they have the right ideas, and it's just up to you to listen to them and harvest these ideas in search of solutions. So that was, I think, the link, that's the missing link between the argument that's often made that social innovations, and you can think of social innovations as governance innovations, happen very often outside government and happen very often outside, and less in the business world than elsewhere. And I think the reason for that has to do with the very organizational characteristics of non-profits. So if you buy this argument, then it leads us to the next step. When would we expect that innovative capacity to be in demand? Well, really, do we need those social innovations leading to better governance? Right? And you can think of a very, very simple typology that works with two dimensions. One is complexity. You know, there are policy fields, there are areas of our society that are fairly straightforward. They're not very complex. There are only a few things you need to know and a few things you need to watch. And there are other areas that are much more complex, where there are many, many different actors, where the problem, you're not sure whether the problem is the solution and whether the solution is the problem. And other fields are fairly stable, they don't change much, right? It's the same in 2014 as it was in 1980. And predictions are that in 2013 it's still about the same. Right? Yeah, we have fields like that. But then we have highly fluid and fast-changing fields in our society as well. Education is one, definitely. Right? If you look at education 30 years ago, today the demands made on the education system are quite different. Migration is another one, always changing. Right? Environment. So if you put those together, then you can think about these four combinations. And what I plugged in is the type of governance model that we have. I just labeled them type 1, type 2, type 3. So type 1, you recall, was when we primarily have government doing the work. And type 2 is we have a policy framework between government and private actors. Right? And type 3 is when we have primarily private actors, often in competition with each other, but government tries to coordinate things a bit. Type 1, type 2, type 3. And you see that when we have high dynamic and high complex fields, that's when type 3 governance is probably very, very useful. But you could do it also with type 2 governance. But it means that whenever we have something that is complex and dynamic, government is not the best organization to deal with it when we look for innovation. So type 1 is really good for things that don't change much. Right? The funeral industry doesn't change, car registration, and so on. But others are changing much, much more. I haven't fully thought the examples through because, as you know, Benny suggested this topic to me only quite recently. But I think it would be very useful to see what fields in our society would require what kind of a governance model to generate lots of innovations. And so in the conclusion, I would say that indeed one could make the argument that civil society organizations have a competitive advantage, and that competitive advantage is most pronounced in areas that are very dynamic and very complex. But we should also take into account that business can often move much quicker for reasons that we undoubtedly know, right? Access to capital is one. And the state, the government, can do much more in terms of scaling up innovations and in terms of making sure that these innovations are sustainable. So there are 3 or 4 policy implications that I would like to highlight. If you buy the argument, and you may say, no, the argument makes no sense, then it makes no sense to talk about policy implications. But if you buy the argument that there's something of a comparative advantage to civil society in certain policy fields, then we need to ask ourselves, are we actually doing enough to unleash the capacity that we have in civil society? Right? So if the argument is that civil society contributes to problem solving of modern societies in fields that are highly dynamic and complex, are we putting enough in? And are we letting enough happening? I can't answer that for your country. I would certainly say that in Europe we're probably not putting enough in. When we talk about social entrepreneurship, do we have an adequate supply of social entrepreneurs in our society? And if we have at least a potential supply of social entrepreneurs, so people willing to take on roles of leadership at the local level in civil society, are we nurturing them? Are we turning the potential supply into actual supply? So that would be the first policy decision. Then, assuming that a certain production of innovation happens in civil society, right, and we have these entrepreneurs and so on, do we have enough of a vetting process in place? Vetting process in 2 ways. One is in terms of investment capital, venture capital. So if you have a good idea as an entrepreneur, are there places you can turn to? Right? Is there the equivalent of a capital market in the social field, in the field of civil society, what we have in the business world? And the other part of the vetting process is assuming we have a successful innovation. Right? So somebody had a brilliant idea and she gets support and it seems to be working. How do we get the news out? That it is disseminated properly, that it is put up to scale and scope. Right? Scale, is it replicated in the same way elsewhere? And do we get economies of scale? And scope meaning, is that innovation taken to apply to other neighboring problems as well? And maybe then put up to scale. So scale and scope economies of social innovations. Do we have the right mechanism there? And a big problem in the non-profit field generally is that we have much weaker incentives or weaker signals to pick up innovations. Right? We have a tendency, and that could also be a hypothesis, we have a tendency of innovations not being picked up, right, and reinventing the wheel. And I think that also has to do with the non-profit form. There are no incentives of picking up innovation. So we need, I think, to explore the idea of incentivizing the dissemination and the adoption of innovations in the social sector more generally. I think that is probably the greatest policy weakness I would see. Right? It's not necessarily that we don't have enough social entrepreneurs, that we don't have enough innovation. It's picking up the innovation and making sure it is adequately disseminated and adopted. So with that, let me thank you for your attention, and thanks again for having me.
יש לנו כמה דקות לשאלות, אם יש לכם לפרופסור אנהייר, זה הזמן. כן. You want the... do you have the... רק רגע.
You know that today is Pentecostal, so we shouldn't actually be using these translation devices. So.
Hi, my name is Ravital, and I am a mother of a child with disability, and I'm one of the people that started an organization for parents of children and families of people with disabilities. And one of our problems is that we are a civil organization. We are not gathered in any legal way, and the problem is that the government prefers to work with organization of the third parties because they give them services and they are working with them for such a long time that they started delegitimizing people like us, so they're saying we are working with the public because we're working with the organization, when actually they're not, because those organizations are no longer serving the citizens. And I wonder how can we go through this obstacle of the government delegitimizing us so they will not need to hear us.
Yeah, of course I can't comment on that specific case, but it's not at all unusual. Whenever you have a relationship between government and non-profits, so that the non-profits become the privileged partner of government, in the long run that creates exclusion effects. You can only change this through political mobilization. But you need to put a pressure not only on government but also on those non-profits. I think you just need, you have to keep at it. We had a similar problem in the United Kingdom when government had a very cozy relationship with the Royal Society of the Blind, for example, and the Royal Society of the Blind had a very paternalistic attitude towards people with impairment in terms of one way or another, and it led to a rebellion at some point. Right? So, but it was a long-term process, took quite some time, and I could give you examples in Germany where something similar happened, and the non-profit organizations built up a tremendous inertia, and it's only political pressure that will move that. You need to, maybe you can form a coalition. Perhaps you're not the only.
We are a coalition. We are a coalition of families of people with disabilities, with not a special disabilities, because this is one of the problems, because the government is gaining a lot from saying, you know, I give to the autistic and I don't give to the people with the mental disabilities. And then they come to the people with autism and say, you know, we give to the blind and we don't give you. And this way they manage to make them not work together. And we are a coalition, and this is why the government is so afraid and delegitimizing us through the, you know, it's unbelievable. They just gave 700,000 shekels to a public media just to get out messages that we are not legitimate. They just put out 700,000 shekels just so to put in the media in different ways, not to work with us.
Yeah. As I said, I cannot comment on this, but you seem to have it's an advocacy problem that you need to advocate for your own cause. And I was referring much more to the problem of social innovation. I don't think you need to innovate. You just need to be a smart advocate. And if the government fears you, I think that's the first step. Right? That they do take you seriously, from what I understand. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm the head of an educational leadership program, a graduate program in an education institute in Haifa. And I'm about to launch an innovative path being connected with this, the third sector center for quite some years. I've heard you before. My question is, I want to add to my program a few courses that have to do with the leadership of non-profit organizations. This will be something new that does not exist in Israel. And my question is, what would you put the focus on in such a program? I know it's a question, it's a big question, but how would you merge the issues of the third sector or civil society and educational institutes within such a program of leadership? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, I like difficult questions. See, I'm not an expert in education, so I'll say a bit less on that. But I think when it comes to leadership, there's this long-standing debate: is leadership something that you're born with, or is it something that you can learn? And the answer is probably somewhere in between. So I would say, my experience of teaching, I don't know how Benny thinks about this, but my experience of teaching about non-profit management, non-profit leadership for a number of decades now is that the people we attract to our courses are typically not very theoretical minded. They simply want to change the world, or they want to change something around us. So they're more focused on the concrete. So I would say make sure that you have as many real world case studies in your curriculum as possible. Let them tackle leadership challenges that really happened, and give them, in dealing with the case study, outcomes of possible courses of action that could have been taken. And then in the end confront them with the course that was actually taken by those in charge of the organization. Right? So focus on concrete case studies, and if at all possible, I would say invite the person who was in that position to meet your students. We did that in LA, at UCLA. We did case studies of local nonprofits. And they were all contemporary, so the case studies were not old case studies, they were 6 months or a year old. Right? And then we had students work on the case study. They came up with proposals, and then as a surprise guest, we had the manager or the leader of that organization appear, and the students had to present whatever they came up with to that person. And it was beneficial to both parties because you had a feedback mechanism, and you didn't get too overly abstract in that. So that's my suggestion to you. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I was interested that in all the presentations today, we kind of didn't focus on the role that business, the private sector, could play, a larger role than they can play in helping both government and civil society be innovative and meet their goals. And I'm interested that you didn't focus on that today, because I see it, at least in Israel, when you talked about civil society having more of an opportunity than business to be innovative. I'm not sure that that's true in Israel. High-tech innovation in Israel is very, very strong, and I would think that it would behoove us to try to tap into that, to build partnerships here between private sector and civil society that could move us further along quicker with investments as opposed to philanthropy. If we think about corporate social responsibility, that was very big in the last 10 years, it seems to me that it could be taken into a more effective area if there was partnerships as opposed to philanthropy between businesses and their SCR units, and what the goals of some of the organizations are trying to create. And I'd be interested in hearing your comments on that.
Thank you. You're right, I didn't focus on business for obvious reasons. Benny said I should say something on civil society, but you have a very good point. We tend to somewhat neglect the potential of business in new kinds of partnerships with non-profits, and they're good. They're very, very good examples of where it happens. But we tend to have still very much a civil society government focus in the way we look at the world, and we forget the potential of business. But I also know, and I'm a big business fan, I should say that. I also like civil society, but I think there's something about business that is quite good. But you need to keep in mind that the incentive structures of business are much harsher than those of civil society. And why does business innovate? Because they want to make a profit. Even if they say, oh, it's corporate social responsibility, that goes only so far. So I think we need to have a very open and frank conversation with leaders of the business community about what their expectations are. And they should not hide behind the sometimes woolly language of corporate social responsibility. I think to move from philanthropy to something else, social investment markets is a very, very good one, but we have to do it in open ways. And you see, and I don't know what happened in Israel, but in the US, corporate social responsibility during the financial crisis and the economic was the first out. And you could see that it was all, they were fair weather friends, but they were not true friends or true partners. So yes, there is a lot that can be done, but I think perhaps we need to start with first principles. Who funded what? The who funded innovation? Who gave that? Yeah. See, that's really a good point that you make. See, my argument is that the potential for innovation, there is a competitive advantage for civil society, but it doesn't mean that they can carry it all the way through. The example there, you need business or government to come along, or some foundation, some third party that helps you with the resources. And I didn't elaborate on that, but in the social impact bond case, I don't know whether you're familiar with that. I'm sure many of you are. What happened is that we have three parties coming together. Without going into any great detail, you have government. In this case, it would be the district, the council authorities in England. You have the social welfare organizations, and they tend to be non-profits, they're charities, right? And it needed a third party to come in and break that cycle, and that were private investors. But to get the idea that, oh, we need private investors, we need some form of an investment market here to reallocate risk, that came from civil society, right? So keep in mind, civil society may have the idea, but the civil society representatives may not be the ones to implement it. and make it work. Right? So you need to move money at some point. You need to have access to capital, which is it's better in some countries than in others. The US is, I think, developing a social capital market, social investment market, and in Europe we're really behind, unfortunately.
Thank you for a challenging lecture. It occurs to me that there is not competition between it occurs to me that there is competition now between the three sectors. Which one is more innovative? I mean, we now know that government is claiming back the right to be regarded as innovative, which is absolutely true, and it was said before that some of the major innovation in the private sector originated in government. So I'm wondering, when we look into innovation in the social sector, whether we actually are not competing in the wrong place. Namely, the market innovations have a certain characteristics. They do not include usually big social innovations, health, education. Government, on the other hand, is probably the right place for those big social innovations, not for market-oriented, consumer-oriented. Now, I'm just thinking aloud, of course, provoked by your ideas. The social sector in services provision, this is the place I would look for some kind of a breakthrough, which government nowadays seems not to be, or the state is not capable, and certainly the private sector. So I would look into this direction, not so much into the advantages that you mentioned, just to be explicit. Multiple stockholders, politics has more than the social stockholders. And I can go on, I don't want to take too much time. So I think that we should think in focusing it in more specific areas of innovations. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I take that more as a comment rather than a question. No, but it's a very useful one. But let me say that I think it's probably good to classify innovations, and there are those innovations where you can attach property rights, intellectual property rights to them, and they are marketable, and that's what business does. And most of the innovations we have are business innovations, but I'm talking about a very different kind of innovation that you may not have a ready-made market, and you cannot establish intellectual or other forms of rights to them. They're inherently social, right? And for them, I think business has more of a disadvantage because they have no incentive to produce these kinds of innovations. They may, but it's not their main business. Government, however, could have, but for whatever reason, government finds it difficult or has found it difficult, or the governments that I know and I study have found it difficult to come up with the kinds of innovations that we attribute with major reforms or even reform efforts in the past. Right? So government seems to have stalled. I don't know, I can't comment on Israel, of course, but certainly the governments in Europe and even the United States, they have stalled in producing innovations. And I argue, well, that may well be the case, but there is the social sector to look at as a source, and that has also disadvantages, as you pointed out.
Yeah, just quick comment or maybe a question. It seems to me that when I hear about social innovations these days, at least in Israel, from the experience on the ground, we hear more about the funding aspect of the innovative funding aspect, where we start talking about those fourth sector type of organizations, whether it's those restaurants or those shops that you have with disabilities, and less of the actual service. So I'm just a little bit echoing what I heard right now. So I'm wondering if it's something that it's my interpretation, but is it something that you also feel present in Europe or maybe outside, where when you talk about social innovations, a lot of times you think about how are you going to make a so-called profit in order to decrease your dependence on philanthropy or government funding?
I think that resonates very well, because the pressure put on non-profits is typically a pressure on the financial side by government not saying, oh, we can't fund you at a level before, or you change the the contracting regime by introducing this or that new model. So the incentives on non-profits is to look at new ways of revenue generation. So that is not surprising. But you see, not every way of generating new revenue for non-profit is necessarily a social innovation. I see the social innovation much more at the problem, right? So the social innovation that is needed to make sure that the lady up here said she has a disabled child. See what do we do about that, and much less about how those organizations that now get government funding maintain or change their revenue structure.
You had discussed earlier innovations in governance,
Yeah.
providing 3 different kinds of potential governance structures. These innovations, have they come from, in your experience and your research, have they come from the government, or have they come from the social sector itself, or maybe a combination of the two? And sort of part B of the question, could you perhaps list or name a country or two that you think is doing it successfully?
Oh, on the latter part, that's a very short list.
Always start with
because
easier ones.
first of all, I haven't looked at all countries, and so, but the ones that I know a bit, there is one country that does a lot of innovation, that generates lots of new ideas, but that's not very good at following through and giving them enough chance to prove their worth. Right, and that's the UK. Right, so it's no coincidence that the social impact bonds and come from the UK. I mean, it takes a certain governance structure, right, to let these ideas generate. But whether the UK is in fact the countries that is best at implementing the social innovations, I don't know. I think Switzerland and Austria also quite innovative in that regard when it comes to social services as well. What was the first part for your question again?
In terms of the source for these innovations in governments,
Yeah,
are they
I think
coming
that
from
was
the government, the social sector itself, or perhaps a combination of the two?
It's very often a combination. We look. There is no inventory of all the social innovations out there. So whatever social innovations we looked at part of our work is somewhat biased because we found out about them through internet searches or by contacting experts. And at Harvard there is the Ash Institute at Harvard looks at social innovations, but they, like so many things in the United States, have a US bias. Right? And would we find out about some social innovation in Korea or in Japan or in Singapore? Not necessarily. But for the ones that we looked at, we saw that there's an interesting finding, and that's the one I presented, is that many of these innovations involve civil society. When you see involve civil society, it's not that it's civil society only. Right? But it's less government only. That was the argument. So it's very often a co-production of some sort.
Thank you.
That was it. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Let me get out of the way.
Thank you very much, Professor Anheier, for your very illuminating lecture. Thank you.